Well, hello everyone, and welcome to the podcast. And I'm really happy for you to get to know today Edy Nathan. Welcome, Edy.
Good to
Glad you're
be
here.
here.
Yes, yes. And Edie has got a book out, and she's going to be talking about that some. But Edie, as I start with everyone, tell folks a little bit more about yourself and how you've landed where you've landed.
We all have stories, and those stories frame us. And the way that those stories frame us is they are experiences that we have that allow us to see the world in a different way. They're often not invited, and grief is just one of those things that comes in, it's not invited, and it comes in ways that are sometimes unexpected and sometimes expected. So when I was 27, I lost my partner. We'd only been together for 2 years. And that loss framed the next many, many years of my life. I went back to school and decided that instead of being an actor and instead of going into the corporate world and doing training, that I was going to become a therapist and talk about grief and write about grief and learn as much as I could from really around the world about how people dealt with grief. And uh, my work is hmm, it's paying the life of my partner forward.
Hmm.
And it is my way of honoring my love and honoring who my partner was to me at that point in my life.
Hmm. Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. Yeah. And and Edie and I were chatting before we started recording, and I think many of you know just in my story is that my wife passed away to almost 2 years ago now after a long battle with breast cancer and all the metastasis of that and that sort of thing. So it's a topic. I was telling Edie kind of tongue in cheek, I love this topic, and it just sounds kind of counterintuitive, but yeah.
Right.
So, but I've had a lot of experience with not only living it, but also worked in the funeral business for several years before I became a therapist. So, very familiar with it. So, but Edie, one of the things that you said that was just really intriguing is that it's something that I'm paraphrasing here, but it's something that just enters our life and we don't necessarily want it to, but it does.
Yeah, that's right. And we we actually experience grief from the moment we're born. And we don't necessarily realize it or think about it, perhaps. But the minute that we leave the safety of and warmth of that womb and the umbilical cord is cut, there's
Hmm.
a certain grief. There's the loss of what we knew as we were forming and the warmth of of that womb. And it is a certain kind of, I think, legitimate leave taking of something that was part of our incarnation, if you will. And
Hmm.
how we move with that, how we carry that will be different for everyone, just like the way that we cope with grief after the loss of a loved one is going to be very different, and no one experiences it the same way, even though you might say, oh, I feel anxiety, or I feel anger, or I'm feeling like I need to forgive, or God, I feel numb. The way that you experience any of those things that I just mentioned,
Hmm.
they're yours, and they rest with you in such a way that is personal to you.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, that's very true. And just doing the study that you have and just learning about grief, what I know that there are a lot of myths around grief and what it is and what it's like for people. And I think, as you said, everybody has their own experience. But I think one myth is that it's a linear process, I think. You want to
Oh,
say
yes.
something about that?
Oh,
Yeah.
oh, thank you so much for mentioning that. You are just so right on. And I can't talk enough about the fact that it is non-linear. So I want everyone who's listening to understand what nonlinear means. Nonlinear means that grief is crazy making because it doesn't follow a path. It's not like we're going to go from the numbness, what I call the emotional armor phase, and we're just going to nicely move from there to roll confusion, because I have these 11 phases, to the despair and the depression, and it just doesn't follow that way, because some people don't feel depressed. They feel anxious. They feel anger. And that's
Mm-hmm.
what they experience second. Because I do think
Mm-hmm.
the first phase is a coping phase that our minds and our bodies tend to go to. There might be anger in there, but there is numbness, there is dysregulation, there is this sense of shock, even when there's been a long haul waiting for someone, or believing that your loved one was indeed going to leave this life, that
Mm-hmm.
that in their leave taking of this life, and knowing that there was going to be a leave taking, people think, well, I'm immune. I'm going to be somehow immune because I've been living it for a year, for 10 years.
Mm-hmm.
Or a diagnosis got changed, and then all of a sudden there's hope. It doesn't mean that upon the loss of that loved one, upon their leave taking, that you're free and clear and that you're not going to be experiencing the many different phases of grief.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that's a
Yes.
myth.
Yeah, and I think it's, yeah, another thing that I've heard along the way is we have this concept of, okay, when you go through the grieving process, you'll come out on the other end and the grief will be resolved in some way.
It's
But
over,
that's
right?
it's over. Yeah, yeah. And so, people say all the time, well, I'll get over this or whatever. But I do not like that just because it's something you move through.
That's
And
right.
there might be, yeah, yeah, you get to a place where, you find joy again. There's a place where you, as I like to call it, you find the new normal,
Mhm.
and that the other person is no longer there, but they are very much a part of you
That's right.
that
That's right.
can't be changed. Yeah.
No, not at
Mm.
all. And it's I think it's why the title of my book is It's Grief, and the subtitle is The Dance of Self-Discovery Through Trauma and Loss. And
Mm-hmm.
people question, well, how could you like put dance and grief together?
Mm-hmm.
And in explaining it, it's a partnership. And when you
Mm-hmm.
experience the devastation of grief, it is about finding a way to partner with it, because it's going to be part of you. It is part of
Mm-hmm.
you. And
Mm-hmm.
I wouldn't actually want it to be gone, because that
Mm-hmm.
would mean somehow that the grief and the losses that I've experienced are just erased, and they make up who I am. They make up, Gordon, who you are. You are
Mm-hmm.
the man who you are, be- because of what you saw, what you went through, what you've been grieving, and your wife is part of you and part of your
Mm-hmm.
story. So to say I'm done is
Mm-hmm.
almost like erasing a story. And
Mm-hmm.
I don't believe in the erasure of a story. I believe in, we are all storytellers, and how do we incorporate and dance with the stories of our life to make
Right.
us richer, to make us more awake and aware and caring of ourselves?
Yes, yes. So what have you found, and kind of maybe walk us through kind of your way of thinking about all of this, and just kind of as you said, I believe you said you had like 11 phases that you've kind of identified
Yeah,
that people can go through. And I would assume that, again, like we have already talked about, it's not a linear kind of thing. It's just kind of jumps
no.
around.
That's
Yeah.
right. And
Hmm.
that's exactly it. I would say that that first phase, which I mentioned, that emotional armor phase, I see that people will go back to that first phase almost as a resting place. That numbness is like a removal. Even shock can be a removal. The kind of the dissociation can be a removal.
Mhm.
Protest, the denial, all of this is like you're just needing a rest from everything that's been going on. But even though I call them 11 phases, they do not in any way show up in order. They might, but they might not. And
Mhm.
my last phase is a phase I call grace. And you might find, oh, in this moment, I'm not feeling anger. And I've been working on the anger that my loved one didn't wait for me to be with them when they died.
Mhm.
This is a
Mhm.
common voiced concern and
Mhm.
deep sadness, and there's an anger there, and oh well, I've come to peace. I have a certain peace around that, and so that is a grace, and it doesn't mean that that peace lasts forever. There might be something that comes in that reminds you of how you felt in the moment of not being there, and maybe you blame yourself, maybe something happened where you just left the room to get a drink of water, and it's like,
Mhm.
what? What the dying teach us over and over again. And Elizabeth Kubler-Ross studied the dying, and she came up with 5 stages of dying, which there's a myth. People think that those 5 stages of dying are for the people who are grieving, and they're a little bit different, and they're actually more
Mhm.
here than not. Um,
Mhm.
and this idea of acceptance, well, I will never accept my partner's death, not really. I I
Mhm.
I I don't want to integrate that, and there's not a closure. There's actually an integration, which is active. Closure feels like the end.
Mhm.
So I like people to think that you're going to come back to anger, and anger is not a bad thing. It's just an emotion that you're experiencing, and then you might experience that grace, or you might experiencing anxiety, or you might experience the despair, and it moves in and out in those very nonlinear ways. So and those 11 phases are very open to the yes and from anyone who is grieving, which means maybe you want to add resistance or resilience to that. Go ahead. Where does that come in for you? How does it come in? That it's not, none of these are in stone.
Mhm. Yes, yes. So you want to maybe mention those 11 different phases,
No,
just so we kind of have an idea about it?
I could, but I really would like to, if you don't mind, focusing on the anger and the anxiety piece, because I think that they're really
Mhm.
important, and they
Okay.
are the fourth and fifth phases. And the reason that I bring them up is people will often feel a tremendous amount of anxiety. They feel like they don't want to leave their homes, or they can't go to work, or they are just overwhelmed with emotion and they don't know how to cope. And
Mhm.
in my book, I have a huge section on anxiety. And I think it's very important to understand that when there is anxiety, it's often commingled with the anger. And I think that for your listening audience, I want to focus on these two pieces, because if they allowed themselves to feel some anger, whatever that anger is, and I'm not necessarily talking about rage where you're throwing glasses or you're hitting things, but just,
Mhm.
wow, what am I feeling angry about? What they might find is the anxiety begins to dissipate. And
Mhm.
anxiety is one of those pieces that just overwhelms. And the anxiety can come from actually the second phase, which is role confusion. Who am I now that I've lost my partner, my child, my parent, my grandmother, my auntie, my best friend? Who am I in the world? Because
Mhm.
the roles need to get reorganized. And you don't want to lose a role. Am I no longer a daughter because I lost my mom? No, you're always going to be a daughter to that
Mhm.
person who was your mother, or
Mhm.
to the grandmother who was your grandmother. And you might not be in an active state in that role, but it doesn't mean that you don't have to lose it. You just find other ways to honor it. How
Right.
do you do that? Well, on Mother's Day, you get a card for your mother and you write a
Mm,
note, even if she's still not around. On Father's Day, maybe you do something that your father loved to do. And that's based on the kind of relationship you might have had with either parent. Same
mhm,
thing for a spouse or a partner.
mm,
How do you honor the role that you had with them? And
mhm,
I just actually lost a very, very dear friend, Robin, who had a 13-year struggle with ovarian cancer and with breast cancer, and she just fought, and then she decided, I'm finished, I'm done. And I'm honoring her right now in this moment by even talking about her.
mhm,
And
mhm,
so it's not, and will my role, I have chills, and will my role as a friend, even if we didn't speak to each other, we could get on a phone 6 months after not talking to one another, and there we were. We were like,
mhm,
just like we weren't talking about the weather. We were just there.
mhm.
So
Yeah.
I think that that role confusion and the anxiety and the anger, and allow yourself to get angry. Allow
Mhm,
yourself to feel it. Ask the questions. What am I angry about? What could I be angry about? Sometimes it has to do with control or a lack thereof. So, and I would say that my last phase is grace, which is what I've also spoken about, and forgiveness. And, there's a lot of other phases in there, but that forgiveness phase, it's not about forgiving who you lost, but forgiving yourself for perhaps how you reacted, or forgiving yourself for needing to hold on perhaps to the negative, which keeps you angry. So you
mhm.
see how it just moves in and out of each other. And it
Right.
is an honoring.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's one of the ways that I like to think about it is that our brain our brains make connections, and we make, like you said earlier, we define ourselves based on relationships and our roles in those relationships. And then when that person is gone, it kind of leaves a void there. And so our kind of, I forget who it was. I guess it was William Ward, and I think I'm saying his name correctly, is one of the early researchers of, grief therapy and that kind of thing. And he used the term the tasks of grief.
Mhm.
And he said part of it is just redefining yourself now that that relationship is no longer, it's still there, the relationship's still there, but the relationship's in a different form now. And
That's
so
right.
that, our brains have a hard time doing that,
That's right.
because we want everything in nice, neat little packages. And the problem
Wanna
with
clean
grief
it
is
up,
that,
don't we?
right, and our brains just don't do that well. And so it's being able to, like you said, give yourself grace to kind of move through the messiness of it all, and have those days where you fall apart, where it just hits hard. And then other days where, yeah, I know in working with some of my clients that are grieving, have gone through grief work, is that they find themselves over time not feeling as intensely the grief that they did in the beginning. And they also notice that they don't feel quite so sad. Then the problem of guilt around that comes in, of, oh, well, I'm not honoring my loved one because I'm no longer feeling it as intense. And so that part of the I think the work of grief is allowing yourself that space to not feel it as intensely. And and that doesn't mean that you love any less, or it's not any less, wasn't any less painful, but it might not feel as intense.
That's right.
Hopefully that makes sense. But
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah, yeah. You said
yeah.
that, actually really quite well, and thank you for that. It is, how does the relationship change to
Hmm.
what you've lost? And when
Hmm.
people come in to see me, I'm not asking them to share their story immediately. What I'm asking is, what are you yearning for? What are you hungry for? Because the yearning
Mhm.
is a loss, wanting to connect to something you've lost.
Mhm.
So you also bring something else up here, which I think is vital, and that I talk about in its grief, which is who you are as a person will also help inform you as to what you need, like what kind of help you need. If you're an introvert
Mhm.
or an extrovert, how the kind of help you need or the kind of help that will help you will be
Mhm.
different. And so I really talk about an assessment. Are you an introvert or are you an extrovert or are you an ambivert? Because that introvert isn't going to want to go to a group. They're not going to want to
Mhm.
go talk to a whole lot of people. They may just want to deal with it on them by themselves, and that's how they do it. Or they may want to just
Mhm.
one person. And that extrovert, give me a group, give me individual therapy, let me tell everybody I see what's going on, and that may be their style. And then an
Mhm.
ambivert kind of does a little bit of both. So it's
Right.
understanding who you are in the world and how you function and how you best take care of yourself that can help you know who to reach out to and the kind of help that might be best for you.
Right. Right. Yeah, it's a matter of, I guess, for lack of a better way to put it, beefing up your emotional intelligence around
Yeah,
what's
yeah,
happening to you and what
that's
you're
right. That's
experiencing. Yeah.
right. And to
Yeah.
give you a language so that I also used, and this is not my turn of phrase, but it's Dr. Chef is his name, and he talked about the over distance and under distance and balance. And I talk about under distance, over distance, and calibration. Calibration is that place on a
Mhm.
seesaw when we were kids. I don't know. Did you ever go on a seesaw when you were a kid?
Mhm.
Yeah.
Sure.
And
Sure.
and it's like you'd use all of your balance to try to just get to that calibrated space. And that's what the goal of the grief is. It's like let's get to calibration. And you're going to
Mhm.
go up and down a little bit, but you're going to get calibrated. The underdistanced is when your emotions are all over the place, but you have a languaging for it. I'm
Mhm.
distanced. Over distanced is complete numbness, complete
Mhm.
distance. And it will vacillate, it will move. Like sometimes you'll be under distance, sometimes you'll be over distance, sometimes you'll be calibrated. And usually that calibration is a sign of grace.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So I would say, yeah, you use the word grace, and I'm curious as to what that means to you and how that might fit into this, because I've got kind of a connotation myself about the grace, but I'm interested in knowing how you think about it.
So, it's interesting. It was hard to choose the word. It was for that last phase because it wasn't closure and it wasn't going to be okay, you're done. What is it? What does the body feel like? And so it could have a religious connotation for many,
Hmm.
and if it
Hmm.
does, then whatever that means for them. It's a very open kind of perspective, but I think of grace as that place when you're with family and friends and everything feels calm and good and loving, and everything in that moment is okay.
Hmm. Hmm.
And there's not an internal struggle in that moment that's going on.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that's what I think of as grace.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's like
I like that. I like
being
that.
right with the self enough.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. That's good. That's good. Well, Edie, I know that we could probably spend all day, you and
All
I,
day.
talking about this topic, but got to be respectful of your time. And, hopefully we can have more conversations in the future. But tell folks how they can get in touch with you and find out about the book and all of that
Sure.
sort of thing.
Absolutely. So I've got a website, which is edynathan.com. And if you mention this show, you'll get like a free download of part of a book or part of this, like one chapter of the book, or I think you might have some choices of what you'd like.
Mm-hmm.
You can see me on Psychology Today and of course Facebook and all social media. And you can also email me and you can do that through the website. So the book is
Awesome.
called It's Grief, The Dance of Self-Discovery Through Trauma and Loss. And I also have a new journal, and it's called It's Grief Notes to Self. And everything can be found on Amazon and Goodreads and any booksellers, and also libraries. If you want to just take the book
Mm-hmm.
out, you can also see it on, in most of
Awesome.
your libraries.
Yeah, and we'll have links in the show notes and the show summaries for people to find that easily and get to it quickly. So, but
Beautiful.
Edy, thanks again for being on the podcast. Any parting thoughts you have for folks?
Just one.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a big lover of The Wizard of Oz. And The Wizard of Oz is very much the hero Shiro's journey. And Dorothy had to meet her tasks, if you will, that you referred to, and kind of faced the grief of leaving her family and growing up. And what grief does is it kind of causes you to have to grow up a little bit in ways that you don't want to. And what she needs on her journey is she needs to develop her brain and she needs to develop her heart and she needs to develop her courage. And she does that through that tale. And that this is really the work of grief, to hone in on your brains, to hone in on your heart and the heart centered work and your courage, because it takes a lot of courage to walk this path of grief.
Mm-hmm.
And to know, like Dorothy, that when she got to the Emerald City and she had those red shoes, but she never knew the power of those red shoes. And whatever you are wearing or embodying, that you've had the power all along to
Mm-hmm.
know how to take care of you during the hardest times that grief presents.
Sure, sure. That's great. That's wonderful. Well, Edie, thanks again for being on the podcast, and I'm sure we'll be in touch and
I hope
have
so.
more conversations in the future.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Gordon.